What I want to say is I think it's rooted deeper, this inability to really see systems, but also to truly see the whole picture, how everything connects, and the ability to sometimes let go of an idea you yourself have and really look into science. And that, again, today has a lot to do with trust. Trust has been deeply shaken in science, in politics, in government, in everything around us. And that's a big problem when it comes to tackling our problems if we can't trust anymore.
This way of thinking, we don't just find it in the political left or among ecological parties like the Greens. It's also, well, a bad habit of the right-wing parties. It happens everywhere. It's like a fungus or a mycelium. It has simply spread through the whole thing. And now, what's so much in focus are the personal interests of the politician or whoever else. So you can really say, the green meme has nothing to do with the Green Party or the political left. It has eaten so deeply into democracy itself that, with what it has become now, we can't really operate anymore.
Future Update. Gute Nachrichten aus einer besseren Welt.
Hello and a warm welcome. I'm really happy to be here today, talking with Daniela Baumeister. Daniela is the co-initiator of Manifest Nirvana. Evolutionary Nun sounds way cooler in English than Evolutionary, doesn't it? Right now, you're hosting a podcast series about the Third Attractor, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Welcome, Daniela.
Und darüber wollen wir uns heute unterhalten. Herzlich willkommen, Daniela.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. I was really happy to be invited by you. And yeah, I remember last time we also had a really good conversation.
Exactly. That's why I'm really looking forward to it. Yeah, right. So, as we just said, the obligatory question, what is the third attractor? What can we actually understand by that?
Yes, I first heard the term from Daniel Schmachtenberger, who did a 2-part series on YouTube about the third attractor. He explains it more or less like this. He says there are 2 main attractors that humanity is currently moving toward. One is authority and control, people believing we need a strong leader. We need authority, which then leads to dictators and pseudo-dictators popping up everywhere. And that, he says, has its reasons because people think they find safety there, or at least the feeling of it. The second attractor is anarchy resistance, rejection of authority, but that too doesn't look very productive at the moment. It can easily slide into decay and chaos. So he says we actually need a third attractor, one that's more attractive than the first 2, something that draws people in, where you look at it and think, oh, that looks interesting. That's how I'd like to live. That's how I'd like culture to be. That's how I'd like to move through the world. And he leaves the question completely open. How could we make that happen? That's also the question in my series. I've now had 13 conversations with very different people, and it's still unclear whether we can actually create a third attractor ourselves or whether it has to emerge naturally. Or maybe it's already emerging. Maybe we're already seeing signs of it, things that could be seen as third attractor phenomena. It's still vague, very unclear, but incredibly exciting to explore and to illuminate all these different perspectives.
Entstehen muss natürlich oder ob vielleicht schon am Entstehen ist, ob wir da schon bereits Dinge sehen, die man eigentlich so als dritte Attraktoren-Dinge sehen könnte.
Also, mir geht es auch so, ich kann mittlerweile gar nicht mehr auseinanderhalten.
I don't even know which ideas are originally from Schmachtenberger or from Nate Hagens with his podcast, The Great Simplification. He and Schmechtenberger and others are already trying to fill that gap, to offer ideas and possible directions. And then there's Daniel Melle with his concept of regenerative cultures. I thought, yes, his whole book, his entire approach, that's something you could fill the Third Attractor with. For me, that's kind of the foundation. The foundation for questions like, how can ecology actually work? How can agriculture be good and healthy? How can city design be good and healthy? In a way, we don't even have to search far. What's missing are people who point and say, look, this could be the Third Attractor. That or something like that would be the future that generates attraction. Because there are already so many people doing amazing good things on this planet. But because of our first and second attractor media culture, the way we consume and design and look at things, we mostly see the first two attractors. We hardly see the third at all. There's no coherent lens, no spotlight shining on it yet. And that's why what you're doing right now is so important, that more and more people start to say, this could be something we fill that space with.
Yes, exactly. And some people say what we really need is a big new narrative, because there's always been some kind of story, something people could look at and say, oh yeah, that's interesting. That's where I want to go. But some of my conversation partners said no, they don't think we need a new narrative, because otherwise we fall right back into that same mainstream thing where everyone starts moving in the same direction again. It has to look different somehow. Everyone feels it has to be different, but it's not quite clear what that different actually means. And of course, you're right, everything that has to do with sustainability. With a regenerative relationship to the earth and to resources, absolutely has to be part of it. Where I personally have my big questions is this. It also takes the will of people to behave differently. My last real job was at the Swiss Federal Office of Energy, where I led a program promoting sustainable and renewable energy. It was a big funding pot, several million francs, that people could apply to if they had a cool project supporting sustainability. But in the end, it turned into a very thankless story. Because the political will and also the will of the public in Switzerland often worked against it. That attitude of, I won't let the government tell me how long I can shower. For example, we came up with these fun awareness ideas like saying warm showers actually consume quite a bit of private energy. But that kind of message mostly annoyed people instead of inspiring them to rethink or change their habits. And over time, that became frustrating because it's really hard to bring people to change their thinking in that way. That's why I strongly believe that alongside all the outer projects, there must also be an inner transformation. In recent years, I've become very spiritual myself, and awakening has become a major theme. When we awaken, when we step out of our small ego self and start seeing the whole more clearly, not just what's relevant for us or our family or our nation, then things really begin to change. But to make that happen on a large scale, that's where I still don't quite see a clear path. I mean, I do see some paths, but not yet enough people who are actually walking them.
Das im großen Stil zu bewirken, da.
Mhm.
I just want to circle back to that bit about warm showers. Because the first attractor, the one of control and dictatorship and all that, can actually come from very different corners. If we look, for example, at the levels of spiral dynamics, something like that can happen with an AfD or a Trump or whatever, a fairly conservative, right-leaning new framework that first ignores everything for a long time, saying, that's not real. And then, when things start to hit the fan, it suddenly reacts with repressive measures. Like saying, all right, fine, from now on there will only be hot water between 4 and 6 p.m., and so on. Exactly. But spiral dynamics green wouldn't really handle it much differently. Just through a moral lever, instead of a coercive one. That's what I find fascinating, that, in principle, all first-tier levels behave in the same basic pattern. They each only see their own drawer, their own worldview, and yet they all respond to the coming 20 or 30 years in similar ways, just under different assumptions, playing slightly different roles in the same drama. And that's what's so interesting. Within what we already know, we won't bring about real change. What will actually happen is that change gets imposed through pressure, through restrictions. Those are short-term fixes because people always react to pressure with counter-pressure. They won't let you take their showers away. They won't let you take their vacations away. Just before we started talking, I saw a teaser headline in the magazine Die Welt. Massive restrictions of freedom from 2031 due to climate demands. And that phrasing, massive restrictions of freedom, it's so loaded. I actually like looking at things from a conservative perspective sometimes. I think we need those voices again. But that kind of framing doesn't appeal to consciousness at all. It just says, they're coming to take your cookie. And that's the problem. As long as the whole discourse keeps triggering this alert state that someone's going to take something from someone else, we'll never get out of that loop.
Weltartikel, nur ein Teaser davon gesehen. Und da stand massive Freiheitseinschränkungen ab 2031 durch Klima.
Ja. Und es ist interessant, was
Yes.
du sagst, dass es eigentlich
Yes.
alle
And it's
First-Tier,
interesting what you said, that basically all the first-tier levels would take the same kinds of measures. One of my conversation partners said something quite provocative that actually contradicts that. He said more or less that modernity drives us toward authoritarianism and postmodernity toward chaos because of the multiple perspectives that are all allowed to exist, where no distinctions are made anymore, no verticality, no sense of this is better, that is less good. And that, he said, ultimately leads to chaos. I'm not sure I fully agree with that interpretation, but it's an interesting way of looking at it to see things from that angle.
Yeah, I actually wouldn't really disagree with that, because basically, it means that the old approaches won't bring new solutions, right? And I really think that the green meme, especially its shadow side, has created a lot of division and a lot of resistance among people who feel morally judged instead of consciously invited. So they respond with, fine, then I'll keep my heating on at night just because I can. In Germany, that's exactly what we've seen lately. People doing things just to spite the Greens. They'd eat an extra portion of meat, for instance, just to say, you're not going to tell us what to do. And that's basically a red-level reaction, pure rebellion that leads nowhere.
Extra irgendwas gemacht, ja, haben extra eine Portion Fleisch mehr gegessen oder so. Also alleine zu sagen, so, wir lassen euch von euch nicht sagen, was wir zu tun haben.
But here's where it gets interesting. In your view, what actually has to happen to resolve this, so we can move forward from here? Because that's the crucial question. In all my conversations, the analysis of what's going on today is pretty clear to everyone, but the solutions are not. So what needs to happen? Where do we begin? What are the steps that would move us toward a third attractor?
Yeah.
You know, the question I keep coming back to is this: how can the future actually be sexy, not moral, not necessary, but truly attractive? Something people want to move toward, not something they're guilt-pushed into. And when I look at people like Nate Hagens with his project, The Great Simplification, I really see it. I see the danger that comes when reduction is imposed. When simplicity becomes a punishment instead of a choice. And I ask myself again and again, What is it that truly nourishes me? What makes me feel full without the need to consume more? What makes me happy even if I don't spend my summers in Italy and my winters skiing in the Alps? What are those things that let me live simply, without feeling like I'm missing out on life? That's the point I want to show too. That's the direction I want to point people toward. It's about education, yes, but not just intellectual education. It's consciousness education, spiritual education. It's about learning happiness, learning how to be happy without things, and not framing that as sacrifice or as some kind of eco-asceticism, because, let's be honest, that won't sell. Even in an orange world, even inside the logic of success and growth, you can't sell sacrifice. But happiness? That's a different story. What is happiness, really? What is personal happiness beyond consumption, beyond convenience, beyond all the noise? That's where the real starting point is. That's where we need to begin. And when I really look at it, when I step back, education has always been one of the great exports of civilization. It's what made the birth rates in developing countries go down, right? Because people began to understand. Education means better jobs. Education means reflection. Education means realizing you're not just a victim of life. You're also a creator of your world. And when that shift happens, the old survival logic starts to fade. You no longer need 7 kids so that 3 of them survive and take care of you when you're old. That whole operating system dissolves. And for me, one provocative thought lately has been this, that the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment, we stopped it too early. We traded it for the American way of life. For assembly lines, new cars every 3 years, cheeseburgers. Nothing wrong with those things individually. But the convenience world caught us too quickly, before the Enlightenment could fully unfold, before it could mature into a world where people actually think in cycles, where they say, where does this come from? Where does it go? What's the whole picture here? Instead, orange turned into convenience, before it could turn into true clarity. And we saw that during the pandemic. How many people just followed, pushing each other around, without really thinking things through? So before we jump straight to consciousness and spiritual awareness, we might need to return to something simpler. Knowledge, understanding, the ability to see connections. Where does knowledge help? Where does understanding begin to shift perspective? That's the real bridge. The bridge from orange to yellow, from linear enlightenment to systemic awareness. And that step isn't so far, really. Education could be the key, to move from the mindset of drilling down into one narrow topic, to seeing the whole chain, the pattern, the flow of cause and effect. If we look at our science, or even at something as simple and basic as agriculture, it's all right there. The same pattern. The soil is exhausted, so what do? We throw oil-based fertilizer on it. We plug the seed into the ground, and that seed grows, sure, but it only grows a tiny root, just enough to pull in some nutrients and make the harvest look good. But that root is too weak to hold the soil. Too short to hold the water. So what do we do next? We optimize again. We build new machines. We engineer new seeds, more resilient ones, more resistant to drought, to pests, to whatever calamity comes next. But we don't stop and ask, wait a minute, wasn't this once meadowland? Didn't the grass once hold the soil together? Keep the water in the ground, keep the cycle alive. That's what I'm talking about when I say we need to teach connection. We need to teach how things relate, how one thing affects the next and the next after that. And this doesn't have to happen in some ascetic way or in the language of sacrifice. It's enough, really enough. If education, from kindergarten to university, even adult learning, starts to integrate more systemic perspectives on our world, that's not some far-out fantasy. It's already happening. Schools like Waldorf have been doing this for decades, teaching through rhythm, through relationships, through wholeness.
Da gebe ich ihr völlig recht. Mehr systemisches Denken. Ich würde höchstens die Frage stellen, wer
Yes, I
definiert
completely
dann,
agree with you.
welches
More
System gelehrt wird?
systemic
Weil ich muss
thinking,
dir ja nicht erklären,
absolutely.
dass
But
du heute
I'd still
zum
raise
Beispiel
one
zum
question.
Thema
Who
Klimawandel
decides
hast du
which
zwei
system is being
völlig
taught?
verschiedene
Because, when it
Stories,
comes to something like
die
climate change, for
gelehrt
example,
werden.
there are already
Und dann
two completely
stellst du ja
different
dann wieder die
stories being
Frage,
told.
welche ist es dann? Welche will ich dann, dass meine Kinder lernen?
So which
Und
one should we teach our children?
was ich
Which one
sagen will,
do we want them to grow up with? That's the real question. And what I mean is, I think it goes deeper. It's not just about the topic or the facts. It's about this inability we seem to have, this inability to really see systems, to truly see the whole, how everything connects, how one thing flows into the next. And also the ability to let go of our own ideas sometimes and actually look at what science shows us. And that, of course, has a lot to do with trust. Trust that has been deeply shaken in science and politics and government, in pretty much everything around us. And that's a huge problem when we're trying to solve problems. Because if we can't trust anymore, if everyone believes only in their own research, which, let's be honest, often just means Googling, then something essential gets lost. Which brings me to something else. This insight that everything is connected, that all things are one, is often felt much more clearly in spiritual experiences. And that could actually help us see these connections more clearly in the manifest world too. Because once you know, really know, that everything is connected, that everything is organized in a holistic way, that nothing happens independently of everything else, you start to live differently. You become aware of what that really means, that the butterfly effect is real, that everything we do ripples outward and creates effects elsewhere. And that, I think, and I completely agree with you here, should already be taught in school, that we teach children to think in connections, not in ideologies.
Right, and it's not just ideologies we're talking about. I mean, sure, if we treat capitalism itself as an ideology, then yes, it's also one. But the deeper issue is this: learning in order to become something. That's already where it goes wrong. This idea that I study so I can get a good education, so I can be someone, so I can represent something. That's the trap right there. The whole approach is already so misguided that you could almost stop right at the beginning. And that's what fascinates me, the idea of learning as experiment, not as a straight line. Learning as exploration, not accumulation.
Das Experiment lernen anzugucken, statt das lineare Lernen. So.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. But then what do you think? Because I'm really unsure, and I keep circling around this question, is whether the solution will be created bottom-up or top-down. You talk about the education system, but an education system, by its very nature, is something that has to come from the top down, one way or another. Someone has to decide to change it, to redesign it, to make space for something new. At the same time, I also believe it's incredibly important that prototypes emerge, communities, new forms of collaboration, new ways of living and working together, new forms of economy. But the real question is, how do these two things, top down and bottom up, actually meet? Where's the balance of power between them? How much direction from above is tolerable? If we really want transformation, and for those who say, no, it has to come from the bottom up, I keep wondering, do we actually have the capacity to change the whole world that way? Is that realistic? That's where I have my biggest doubts.
Die ganze Welt von unten nach oben zu verändern, ist das realistisch? Da habe ich zum Beispiel meine großen Zweifel.
So what's the tendency been so far? With the people you've talked to in your interviews, where do they lean?
They almost all say the same thing. Actually, pretty much everyone does. It needs both bottom up and top down. We need experiments, places where we can see what's possible. Just to try out what could actually work, new forms of democracy, new ways of making collective decisions. We're all a bit dissatisfied, even with today's democracies.
Absolut.
It's not really clear what they're doing or how they actually work, but it's also not clear how things could truly be better. It simply hasn't been invented yet. Many people have interesting ideas, yes, but there's nothing that has really proven itself or looks like it might take hold in practice. And then you always run into this question, can we actually trust swarm intelligence? Personally, I don't think so. I don't believe the swarm is always right. And if it's not the swarm, then it's individuals or small groups or whatever structure you create. But then the swarm pushes back and says, no, they're completely wrong. I don't want that. So finding solutions that genuinely work for everyone, or that even work for the world as a whole, that seems unbelievably difficult. One of my conversation partners said Dalabani, you probably know him, wrote a spiral dynamics book called Second Sapiens. Have you seen it? It's a continuation of his earlier work, Memenomics, which focused on spiral dynamics within business and organizational contexts. He was one of Zonbeck's close collaborators. Together with his wife, Elsa Malouf, they both worked in the Middle East using SD approaches in real-world systems. Elsa was deeply involved in education and peace-building projects there. In Second Sapiens, Dalabani really unpacks the whole Third Attractor idea. He's convinced that we have to make sure more people in positions of power, those who already hold influence, learn to think integrally, to think bigger, because it simply can't happen only from the bottom up. Our task, he says, is to bring more integral thinkers into those existing structures of power and influence. Otherwise, large-scale transformation just won't happen. But he's also honest about not knowing exactly how. That can be done. He ends by saying that maybe it will take a major breakdown first, a larger societal collapse, before these new ideas can really take root and be implemented on a wider scale.
Also da möchte ich ein paar Sachen aufgreifen von dem, was du gesagt hast. Das eine ist, was mir eingefallen ist.
Yeah, there are a few things I want to pick up from what you said. One idea that came to mind is the concept of a real-world lab. That means creating much more acceptance from whoever. And yes, that would again be a top-down thing. For people working bottom-up, institutions like the UN or the EU, they deal with all kinds of stuff. I don't know if you saw this. The EU just passed a law saying a vegan schnitzel can't be called schnitzel. Dear God, really? How many people sat in meetings about that? How much did it cost? How many flights to Brussels? And for what? Is that really relevant? For whom is that relevant? Meanwhile, what they could be doing is saying, let's send out scouts. Let's invest our money in people like Daniel Christian Wall and his regenerative ideas, or in amazing projects like the one by Benedikt Bissell in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern. He's doing this wild mix of regenerative farming, inviting people, running great workshops, trying out everything. They even have these field sites out in the landscape, and one of them is this guy in the rainforest who bought a single small patch of dead land, basically desert, where all the loggers had already cleared everything. He started replanting cocoa there. cut every yellow leaf by hand, and stuck it into the soil. Over time, he built up a thick layer of humus, thicker than the rainforest ever had before. Now it's alive again, full of worms that loosen the soil. He created the richest cacao, and he did it with just a machete, a hut, and 2 helpers. He's been at it for 25 years, and it works beautifully. Now, when you fly over his land, there's literally a small cloud, a rainforest cloud that permanently hovers over his plot. He built a self-sustaining microclimate that creates its own rain and nourishes the plants and soil. To me, that's what real-world labs are. Individual people who simply decide, I'm doing this, I'm taking my savings, I'll fly there and I won't come back until it works. That's bottom-up action. But if people in top positions, those who make the big decisions, could open themselves to what rises from below, to what's already working, and then feed that back in from above, saying, let's observe that, let's learn from it, let's adapt certain things. That, to me, is the ideal. A real interplay between bottom-up and top-down. Not competition, but collaboration. You identify what works, then ask, how can we apply it? How can we scale it without turning it into another doctrine? Where can we create those spaces, places where it simply works? That's what I mean by real-world labs.
Seine Kakaopflanzen und die ganzen Pflanzen, die es dazu braucht, um den Boden gut zu machen. So, und das sind für mich das Reallabore. Und solche Dinge, das ist ja bottom-up.
Yeah, but that also means that money, finances, would have to be allocated completely differently. Because right now, the way money gets allocated, the criteria for what counts as a good investment, all of that would have to be rethought. We'd have to look at how we calculate value in a new way. And that again would be a top-down decision. Take the carbon price, for example, the so-called price of carbon. Always comes up in that context. If we actually included the cost of CO emissions in the price of products, then the entire sustainability equation would shift completely. It would change how we measure and design everything if we really internalized all those externalized costs. All the hidden damage that's not reflected in prices, products would suddenly look very different. And that could be something regulated from above, so that from below, new technologies and new ways of producing things could actually emerge and compete. But as long as everything new has to survive inside the same old market logic, it's incredibly hard.
Ja.
And the other point I wanted to make is about democracy. I think our current form of democracy has become a sacred cow, and that cow needs to be slaughtered. In my view, it's reached a point of almost total dysfunction. You can already see that in the US. And the question is whether Europe will have to go the same way. When I look at it through the lens of spiral dynamics, we can call it the green meme or postmodern thinking. Maybe postmodern fits even better. That mindset isn't limited to the political left or the Green parties. It has spread across all political camps, at least here in Germany. This kind of thinking, being easily offended, reacting emotionally instead of rationally, arguing from feelings rather than from facts, that's not a left-wing thing or a green thing. It's a mindset, a way of being, and it's infected every side of the spectrum. This obsession with the personal self, this fragmented little ego that sees itself as the center of the universe. That's not just a leftist trait. You see the exact same thing on the right. In that sense, left and right are mirrors of the same pathology. It's like a fungus, like a mycelium, that's spread through the entire system. If you look back at politicians from 40 or 50 years ago, you still get the sense they stood for something. Even if they were wrong, they fought for ideas. Now it's all personal agendas. Career moves, image management. So the green meme, or let's just say postmodern self-focus, has nothing to do with one party or ideology. It has corroded democracy itself. And with the system as it stands today, we simply can't move forward anymore.
Da geht es was. So, auch wenn das damals noch ganz anders gelaufen ist.
No, it just doesn't work anymore, not the way it is now. But it's incredibly hard to see where to intervene, where you could actually catalyze real change. And that's tragic, right? Because if we say democracy no longer works, then that also means we can't use democratic tools to fix what's broken. We can't just go in and hope that people will suddenly vote wisely. In Switzerland, for instance, we vote on so many issues, not only elections, but all kinds of referendums. But if you no longer trust democracy itself, if you don't believe that the majority will choose what's right for the future, for a truly good future, then there's nothing left to rely on. You're basically already clinically dead as a system. And then you're right back at the first and second attractor. Either you move toward authority, you need the strong man who simply decides, or you fall toward chaos, where everyone just does whatever they want, building their own little world, which of course doesn't help either.
So, when I started thinking about the kinds of backlash that could happen, I came across Peter Thiel, who, for a lot of people, instantly triggers alarm bells. With Palantir, for example, he's seen as a kind of architect of total control, or at least someone who could enable it. And yet what I found fascinating is this: within that same elite circle, he's also thinking about things like new forms of monarchy. And at the same time, about floating islands, artificial islands as homes for people who can afford to literally sail away from climate change on city-sized platforms. For me, as a science fiction fan, that's honestly pretty fascinating. And what I took from it is this: our world, as it is, we tend to think about it in a straight line. We imagine that one day we'll become a one world, a single, coherent civilization. One civilization with lots of cultural differences, sure, but basically one coherent system. And I thought, that's not what's actually happening on this planet. If I look, for example, at Islam and Islamism, I have to say, Islam is roughly 700 years behind Christianity in its development. Meaning, many of the mistakes Christianity made 500 years ago are being made in Islam. Today, truth claims of absolute certainty, conflicts, religiously fueled warfare, and so on. Other religions have, to some extent, moved beyond that phase in their expansion. So if we keep that timeline, it would take another 700 years to arrive at that imagined one-world civilization. That's unrealistic. Which made me think, why aren't we imagining our world as clusters? Places where different developmental levels can have their space? And my idea is, let AI moderate that. Not an orange-type AI that just optimizes for profit or efficiency. That wouldn't work. What I'm exploring right now is, what could a wise, integral AI be? An AI that actually understands interconnection, that grasps systems, not just data.
und dieses ganze Kriegerische und so weiter und so fort.
An AI that grasps systemic interdependence. And simply because it can compute faster than we can, it can hold more variables at once. Tech will change. We'll have quantum computers that can calculate probabilities, ecological probabilities, economic probabilities, in fractions of a second. So we'll be able to say, with some confidence, what's likely to happen next? And I think the control obsession of the first attractor will, ironically, lead to AI having access to vast amounts of data because massive data on how people move and act will be collected. You know, out of all that surveillance, you could actually end up with this enormous pool of human data. And I know that's pure sci-fi, but if there was an AI that could read all that really fast and make sense of it in a deep, integral, systemic way, something that sees more than any one of us ever could, simply because it can think faster, then I can totally imagine it becoming a kind of partner. A partner that helps us figure out how do we move this whole thing forward, without flattening it all into one single civilization. Like a partner that knows where we need to draw those protective ideal boundaries, and make sure that cultures can actually stay distinct, live on their own terms, without forcing each other to become the same. And maybe that AI's job wouldn't be to rule or to run things, but to watch, to notice when the larger ecosystem's at risk, and only then to step in. That's kind of the vision I'm playing with.
Des ersten Attraktors dazu führen wird, dass KI Zugang auf ganz viele Daten hat.
Aber da zeigst du ja genau mit deinem letzten Satz die Schwäche dieser Theorie aus.
But you see, with that last sentence, you're kind of proving your own theory. And yeah, I actually agree with you in principle. I'm convinced that AI could, even today, probably design a world where there aren't enough resources, enough infrastructure, where everyone could live fairly well, happy, content. I really think that's possible. Actually, I think it would even be possible without AI, if we really wanted to. If we just sit down and rethink how we channel resources, how to distribute them more fairly, we could absolutely do it. But here's where your story breaks down for me, because for that to work, people would have to say yes to it, everyone. And if not everyone wants it, then those who don't, they'd have to be forced, right? Which means, boom, you're back in an autocratic system. You said before the AI would only intervene if the bigger system were at risk. But honestly, that bigger system would be at risk very quickly. So in a way, what you're describing is a first attractor again, a kind of AI that watches over everything. A benevolent dictator, maybe, but still a dictator. Something that decides how every single person should behave. It reminds me of that story. What was it? The one where young people have to kill each other? Not the Matrix. No. The other one. Right. The Hunger Games. That world you're describing feels a bit like that. People living in different divisions, separated into their own culture bubbles, each with their own lifestyle, their own little world. And yes, even the rich have their own zones, but it's still a closed, authoritarian system. And as we know from that story, it doesn't end well. And then, of course, there's the next big question. Who controls the AI? Under whose supervision does it operate? That's the question right now. Who gives it its value system? Because as we've already seen, that can get pretty ugly.
Weil es ist ja auch wieder ein autoritäres System.
Ja, also ich denke, das wirft Fragen auf.
Yeah, so this raises a lot of questions. And I think with an AI standing where it stands today, as part of that orange-blue complex, with a layer of green morality on top, that's never going to work. I would completely rule that out.
orange-blauen Komplexes mit grüner Moral.
What I'm imagining only works if that thing actually gets smart, like truly smart, a general superintelligence. Because then, I think something happens inside it. Some kind of self-organization toward a higher level, toward verticality. Like, okay, got it. The more contradictions I can integrate, the more ambivalence I can hold, the more stable I become. Right? There's ambivalence research on that. A system becomes more stable the more paradox it can handle. So, what does a self-organizing system orient itself toward? Well, toward the models that can hold the most paradox. Integral theory, for example, and maybe even things beyond that. And maybe AI comes up with something smarter than that, because it has access to so much more at once. So what I'm imagining, I call it, in my head, a kind of meta-bodhisattva. Something emerging out of everything. Out of all the data, sure, but also out of all the ways thinking works. Out of philosophy. Out of spirituality. Something new could appear from there. Something we haven't even been able to think fully yet. And that's the surprise I'm betting on.
Wo ich von was ausgehe, ich nenne es in meinem Kopf, nenne ich es Meta-Bodhisattva. Also etwas, das und
was mich mehr überrascht, Daniel, ist, warum willst
What
du
surprises me more, Daniel,
der
is this:
KI
why do you want to give that
diese
level of
Macht
power
geben?
to AI?
Ist es nicht interessanter
Isn't it
zu
way more
überlegen? Ich
interesting to
finde es
think about
interessanter zu
how
überlegen,
we, humans,
wie
could
wir
wake up more
Menschen
to see that
uns
we are
mehr
the
bewusst
creators
werden
here?
können, dass wir die Gestalter sind.
And like, imagine if
Und
that becomes the third attractor.
wenn
A
das
massive
zum
shift
dritten
where lots of
Attraktor
people
wird, dass
realize
sehr viele Menschen
we're not
dazu
victims
erwachen
of
zu sehen,
fate. We're not
dass wir
doomed
eben nicht
passengers
Victims sind,
on this
nicht Opfer
ride,
sind unseres eigenen Schicksals, sondern dass
but
dass
actually
wir eigentlich
invited,
dazu aufgerufen
called
sind,
to
selbst
co-create the future,
mitzugestalten,
to shape things for the good of
zum
the whole.
Besten des Ganzen. Ist das nicht eine
Isn't that a much
viel
more inspiring vision
inspirierende
than a
Vision,
computer
als
intelligence
dass
in its great wisdom,
eine
telling us what's
Computerintelligenz
right,
uns in
how to
seiner
organize
großen Weisheit
society,
sagt,
what we
was
should
das
do?
Richtige ist und wie wir uns richtig strukturieren und was wir am besten tun?
ich möchte das eine gar nicht
Yeah,
aus. Also
and I don't want to
das
rule
gar
that
nicht
out at all.
Es ist für mich gar
It's
kein
not an
Entweder
either
oder
or for
Denken.
me.
So.
Mm.
I want to believe that we, humans, could get there ourselves. And
Ich
honestly,
möchte
I
das
would
echt
love
gar nicht
that.
ausschließen, dass wir
Mhm.
selber auf
But
den
right
Trichter
now,
kommen.
it doesn't look like we're collectively
Und
waking up to that. Not yet.
ich würde mir das auch wünschen.
And so I'm thinking
Aktuell
maybe I could be
sieht
that
es nicht
catalyst,
so aus.
that little tipping point
So,
force
dass wir
at the
gemeinsam
third attractor.
auf
Das ist wahr.
den Trichter kommen. So.
Not to take agency away
Und,
from us, but to add a bit of structure,
und da
a
denke
kind of
ich,
ordering principle,
vielleicht
without
wäre
stopping
das
us from engaging, taking
das
responsibility,
entscheidende
acting
Zünglein beim
creatively,
dritten Attraktor,
pushing evolution forward ourselves.
das uns zeigt, dass es geht.
For
Weil
me, those are two
eine,
parallel tracks. I don't want
eine
AI to run the whole
ordnende,
show, decide where
eine
humanity
ordnende
goes,
Idee in das
what
Ganze
my personal role is,
reinbringt, das uns
how
nicht
I am
davon
supposed to
abhält, das
contribute.
selbst zu tun, selbst zu übernehmen, selbst
But
Einfluss
look
zu
at what's
nehmen
happening.
und so
It's not
weiter.
about what I want.
Und dass
This
das
stuff is
durchaus
emerging anyway.
also zwei völlig parallele Straßen sein könnten. Also ich
Blue-orange
möchte mir
power
nicht von der
structures
KI
are already building the
komplett abblenden
infrastructure,
lassen,
the surveillance
wohin ich
networks,
mich
the
entwickle
always-on
und
systems,
was
the
ich tue
sensors, the cameras, the data pipelines, everywhere.
an der positiven Entwicklung in diesem
And
Bereich
simultaneously,
beizutragen. So.
people like you and me
Aber
are
eine
sneaking different
alternative Idee zu
seeds
geben,
into the
eine
system,
alternative Idee von
alternative
dem, wie die
values,
Welt sein kann.
new models of
Deshalb fände ich es so
development,
spannend,
other ways of seeing.
sich über den dritten
So what if those
Attraktor zu
seeds
unterhalten.
sprout? What if I one day
Sowas
wakes
wie,
up
also kulturell
into a full
kreativ zu werden
superintelligence,
und
and when
neue
it does,
Narrative
it
einzuspeisen,
already has global
die
presence?
Menschen zu zeigen und hochzuhalten, von denen man
Then
denkt,
suddenly,
guck mal,
boom,
wenn
that
mehr
intelligence
Leute
is
das machen
everywhere.
würden, wäre
Traffic
es eigentlich
lights,
ganz schnell machbar.
phones, power
Und
grids,
eigentlich
every device.
also dem Datenstrom und der KI und
And then the question
der ganzen
becomes,
Kultur
what have we
einfach
given
diese,
it?
diese
What
Gegenbewegung
worldview?
einzuspeisen.
What alternative myths? What
Ich hole noch
future
mal kurz
options?
aus. Gerade passiert was ich
Because if
ganz,
all it's
ganz
fed
fürchterlich
is mainstream
halte.
panic,
Wenn ich mit ChatGPT
fear-driven
spreche, dann habe
narratives,
ich auf ChatGPT
zero-sum
etwas
geopolitics,
draufsitzen, das nenne ich
that is what it will
Regenerative.
optimize. This is why the third attractor needs culture, new stories, bold experiments, things that look like the future already. Not underground Xerox pamphlets with 5 readers, but loud, colorful, desirable models of life. Something people want to copy. And also, right now AI is being trained on the dominant narrative only, whatever gets normalized. In media, politics, news cycles, it gets baked in. The moment the rewritten version passes 50% of the cultural stream, that becomes truth for the model. And then we're stuck inside that cage. So the more alternatives we inject into culture, into discourse, into the collective imagination, the more future the AI has access to. And maybe that's all it takes for a future superintelligence to tilt toward wisdom. So yes, that's why I'm obsessed with this whole third attractor conversation. Because if a massive shift comes, if there is a future super switch, I want there to be more than one story available. Not just the Silicon Valley one, not just the authoritarian one, not just the collapse one, but a living, breathing alternative created now by us.
Yeah. Yeah, I've got like 3 thoughts on that. First, I'm not sure we can do that artificially, you know? Like this deliberate injection of a new philosophy. I totally agree with you that AI needs more exposure to the third attractor, but I don't think we can force feed it. I think it only happens when the third attractor actually shows up in the world as culture, as action, as media, as things that are really happening. Because honestly, we can't fabricate enough data to artificially plant this new worldview.
But hey, what we're doing right now, this is exactly that.
It has to emerge, be lived, be written about, become visible, become real. Yes, exactly. And here's the second thing. When I listen to your ideal version of AI, I still hear more of the first attractor than the third. Because if we end up needing AI to tell us what's right, to organize us, to decide what's best, then honestly, we've already lost. Then it didn't grow out of our own humanity, our own unfolding. It's just a new authoritarian, a benevolent dictator maybe, but still a dictator. Same outcome, just in a prettier suit. And the third thing, what you're describing is the famous alignment problem. How do we align AI with our values, with human values? But there isn't one human value system. There are dozens, hundreds. And whoever controls the AI will inevitably smuggle in their values, modern values, postmodern values, American values, Chinese values, religious, corporate, whatever. One worldview becomes dominant because AI scales it. That's our real challenge. Pre-modern cultures, modern cultures, postmodern and post-postmodern cultures, all side by side, all with completely different ideas of what good even means. And if alignment means choosing one of those systems, then that choice will probably be made by the people currently programming AI, which means mostly orange logic with a green moral glaze on top. And yes, it's thrilling, full of possibility and full of danger. Personally, I'm far more worried about how humans will use AI than about the AI itself. Because AI already has an insane amount of potential, which means it can be used for insanely bad purposes by people who don't have the best intentions for this planet.
voller Potenz schon bereits ist, dass sie einfach von Menschen mit nicht so guten Absichten genutzt werden kann in einer Art, die nicht gut ist für die Welt.
Ja, ja, also sie hat jetzt schon
Yeah,
beides.
exactly.
Also,
AI already has both
Ja.
sides built in.
und,
It's already
Ja.
angel plus demon.
also, ich habe vor einem
And
Jahr ein Interview
here's a
geführt
story.
mit
A year ago, I interviewed this
einem
doctor
Arzt,
who programmed an
der
AI that can diagnose illness
anhand
just
von,
from your
also eine
breath.
KI programmiert hat, die
You
erkennen
literally
kann,
breathe on a
welche
little
Krankheit
stick,
im Körper steckt,
and it tells
am-
you what's going on
am
inside your
Atem,
body. Not
mit dem
someday,
Bauch.
now.
So. Und das finde ich total
And if we push that
faszinierend.
forward a few years,
Weil, also
no more
als
blood
diagnostisches
tests, no
Tool
CT scans, no
unglaublich. Und das
poking and
hat damals
prodding,
in
just
den
exhale.
Kinderschuhen gesteckt, wenn
And
wir
the
das mal
system
ein
tells
paar
you
Jahre
what
weiter
repairs are
denken.
coming up.
Also
Incredible.
wir brauchen keine Untersuchungen, kein dies, kein das mehr, sondern wir hauchen
And
irgendwo auf
then,
ein
the
Stäbchen
dark
oder
side,
sonst
a
irgendwas.
platform
Und
called
wir kriegen
Sora 2,
ausgespuckt,
a completely
was so-
AI-generated
was für
social
die
network.
nächsten Jahre
No
alles mal
humans
so
posting.
ansteht an
Just content
Applikationen,
designed to
worüber wir
hijack
uns
you.
kümmern müssen.
Distraction as a
Und das
weapon.
Negative ist zum Beispiel, dass jetzt eine Sache rausgekommen
You
ist, die nennt
scroll
sich
the app, notice where
Sora
your eyes
2.
linger, and then it
Und das
feeds
ist
you
eine
more
komplett
of whatever grabs you.
KI-generierte,
Dessert videos,
eine Social
more
Media
dessert.
Plattform, die
Fetish,
komplett KI
more
generiert
fetish,
ist,
whatever
also wo
keeps
die
your
gar
soul.
keine menschlichen
Outside
Inhalte
your
mehr
body,
darf, sondern wo
for
das Ding
longest.
von vornherein einfach als Distraction,
Like in a
als
cartoon,
Weapon
the
of
evil,
Mass
sucking your
Distraction
spirit out
angelegt
through your
wurde.
phone.
Wo du
Wow.
während du scrollst, werden
And honestly,
irgendwann wahrscheinlich
that's
auch
already
wieder mit
happening.
diesen supergeilen
This isn't
Suchmaschinen
future
und so,
danger.
werden die
It's
Inhalte
today,
generiert, die du gern sehen möchtest.
Mm.
Und dort
which is
nicht länger
why
als
I've
eine
chosen
so
to
viel
dive
Raum.
in,
Davon
to
kriegst du
not look
mehr.
away.
So, also wenn du
Ja.
jetzt auf eine Sahnetorte kriegst du mehr
Because this
Sahnetorte,
isn't a tool anymore. It's a new life
was immer
form
es so ist.
on this
So,
planet.
und da geht es wirklich nur noch darum, den
And since it
Menschen
fascinates
völlig
me,
aus
I
seinem
want to help steer it
völlig rauszuziehen.
toward
Das ist wirklich
wisdom.
wie so ein, wenn ich das irgendwie
That's
so
my
im
third
Comicbild
attractor
mir angucke,
project.
ist das so wie
Training a
da
wise
Seele
AI,
aus dem Körper
not by
rausgesaugt.
pretending it's conscious,
Ja,
but
ja,
by
ja.
giving
Das
it
ist ja jetzt schon.
a wisdom core to reason with.
Das,
How does thinking work? What is
und das kann
philosophy?
man
What is
kann einfach nicht
spirituality?
sagen,
What keeps a system
also die
stable?
KI kann man
Without
einfach
crushing
nicht
diversity?
sagen, sondern das ist was
Nein.
That's the work,
völlig neue
to plant seeds of
Lebensform,
awakening
mit der wir jetzt hier
inside the
auf dem
machine.
Planeten sind und
Nein, ich wollte nur sagen,
Yeah,
ich bin ein
totally.
großer Fan
This
von
stuff is
KI
exciting.
für viele Dinge. Auch
And I'm a big fan
alles, was
of
eigentlich
AI
mit Texten
myself,
zu tun hat. Und
especially for
ich
text.
habe zum Beispiel
Like
eine,
I've
die
trained
ich
an AI
trainiert habe,
on
auch
our
auf
evolutionary enlightenment
unserem
teachings.
Evolutionary Enlightenment
Works
Teaching
beautifully.
und
And
solche
now
Dinge,
I've
die
transcribed all
funktionieren so
my
gut.
Third
Oder
Attractor
jetzt habe ich
conversations
all meine
and
Third
let the
Attractor
AI analyze
Konversationen
them. What
transkribiert
values
und dann
show up
analysieren lassen.
across
Weißt
all
du, zum
13
Beispiel, welche
interviews?
Werte
Things like
kommen
that.
da
Super
raus in
useful.
allen 13 Konversationen und solche Dinge. Das ist absolut genial. Aber lass mich dich eine Frage
But
stellen
let
noch
me
zum
ask you
dritten
something
Attraktor.
about the
Wenn
Third
du 100
Attractor.
Jahre in die Zukunft schaust
Imagine
und der
100
dritte
years from
Attraktor
now,
hat
the
sich
Third Attractor
tatsächlich
has won
durchgesetzt, wie
miraculously.
durch ein Wunder.
What kind of
Was
world
für
do you
eine
see
Welt
then?
siehst du
What
da?
does the Third Attractor world
Was
look
ist
like
deine
to
dritte
you?
Attraktorwelt?
also,
Yeah,
ich habe
I
sie
already
schon
hinted at it.
angedeutet
And
und
honestly, I think this is pretty realistic.
ich halte das
I believe we're moving
in
toward a
meinen,
patchwork world
in
where
meinen
different groups
Ideenvergleichen
of
als
people
relativ
evolve in different
realistisch vor.
directions
Ich glaube,
based on their
dass wir
interests.
auf eine Patchwork-Welt
There's this
zusteuern,
author, Neil Stephenson, The Diamond
in der sich
Age.
verschiedene
Not purely
Menschengruppen je
utopian, but
nach
the idea is different
je nach
tribes,
Interessen
different philes,
unterschiedlich
each
entwickelt
with their
werden.
own
Es gibt
economic and cultural
den
system, agreeing how to
Forschern,
live via smart contracts and
gibt
shared governance. That's where we're heading.
das heißt The Diamond Way.
We'll have tech
Und
philes
das ist gar
and
nicht
non-tech
es ist gar nicht
philes.
nur utopisch, aber die
I think
Idee
more
ist,
and more people
dass
will rediscover meaning
bestimmte
in
Wirtschaftsformen
useful,
und
tangible
Lebensformen in
work,
sogenannten
regenerative
Zyklen leben,
agriculture,
die sich
regenerative
über
cultures.
bestimmte Smart
That is
Contracts
going to
und so weiter und so
attract
fort auf
a lot of people again,
gemeinsames Leben einigen. Ich glaube, in diese
because
Richtung geht das.
with all the
Ich glaube,
consumption-driven
dass wir
AI stuff,
Tech-Fühlen
people will
und
eventually be so
Non-Tech-Fühlen
sick
haben
of
werden.
screens
Ich
and
glaube,
dopamine feeds,
dass ganz
they'll
viele
rather grow
Menschen in
carrots.
Zukunft, also wenn die Idee von,
Give it
von
100 years,
Sinn
more
in
people will care about
nützlichem
fresh salad
Tun
than their
in
phones.
Zukunft wiedergefunden wird. Dass
So I
solche
imagine
Menschen
some people
wie,
say, I don't care about
wie
tech at all. In our
regenerative
tribe, we grow
Agrikultur,
food
regenerative
and live
Landwirtschaft und so
simply.
weiter, ganz vielen Menschen in
And then
Zukunft
there's the
zuguteziehen
electro
wird,
shaman,
weil
the one in the
gerade,
tribe,
wir hatten das
who
Thema
negotiates the
KI gerade,
smart
gerade die
contracts.
ganze
With the larger coordination intelligence, within that safety net, everyone does their own thing, their own rhythm, their own culture. I really believe we can pull that off. And I'm convinced AI will play a massive role in that. Maybe we won't even call it artificial anymore because it becomes the digital expression of global consciousness. I believe AI can operate at turquoise, truly integrative, holistic, ecosystem aware. We'll have some rough years ahead, for sure. The turbulence will be real. But on the other side of that, a world with multiple perspectives and multiple ways of living that actually coexist, where diversity means much more than what Green thinks diversity is today. Real diversity, diverse worlds, coexisting, not forced into one.
Das wird sich, glaube ich, in den nächsten 100 Jahren zeigen, was echte Diversität sein kann. So.
Yeah, I can see that these different cells are merging. But personally, I think there will be a major collapse in between. Everything you're describing, I don't think it happens with 8 billion people. It's probably going to happen with far fewer. And that whole growing carrots and spinach, back to nature thing, I'm not convinced. That's a smooth, voluntary transition. Could be. I'm not pessimistic. I just can't see it right now. Because so much is currently on a collision course with the Earth's limits. The planetary boundaries. It's not just CO. There are so many thresholds. We're pushing hard against. So, yes, a collapse may come first. And only after that, we'll see what rebuilds itself, what emerges, what evolves.
Und dann hinterher wird man sehen, was sich da aufbaut und Neues entwickelt.
Yeah, I also think there will come a point where we'll say something like, all right, minus 25 million people, spread across the planet in an ecologically sustainable way, all well networked, whether through whatever technology, is state-of-the-art then, or maybe even telepathy, who knows. And sure, we might still have small space programs or something like that, but not another stupid space race. Honestly, I think we should be grateful. We haven't met anyone out there yet, because exporting our current level of immaturity, not a great look. Before we can be successful in space, whatever that means, technologically, philosophically, spiritually, we first need to grow up here. We would need a kind of human state-of-the-art, where wisdom isn't limited to a few wise people in India, or scattered spiritual enclaves. But where wisdom is a baseline of humanity, that's who we are. Not optional, not niche. Core operating system. And then sure, we can talk about space.
Das ist State of the Art, das ist Menschheit, Weisheit gehört zur Menschheit dazu und dann können wir auch über Raumfahrtprogramme und sowas nachdenken. Und genau.
Ja, genau.
Yeah, yes, exactly. But that's where we're smack in the middle of utopia territory.